You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in your amendment, my understanding is that all tax revenue for school district operations, excluding debt, would be paid in terms of sales tax and income tax collected in the capital and then distributed back out to the school districts. Is that correct?
That's one way to stifle debate. Apologies. You may proceed.
In answer to your question, Mr. Speaker, yes, that is correct. All sales and income tax would go to, it actually does not go to the state general fund, as some might think. It goes to an education stabilization fund, which is a fund that would be created to make sure that the funds stayed within that particular, to operate schools and replace school property taxes. It's a defined fund, if you will.
So will those funds be remitted separately to the state treasury?
The ins and outs of it are essentially the fund is kept separate from the general fund. The money is then dispersed through the channels that are typically available for disbursement, Department of Education and otherwise. No new mechanism is created, but those funds will be driven out to the school district using existing mechanisms.
And the amounts that go to each school district are based on what formula?
There is not a formula. There is a dollar-for-dollar replacement. And by dollar-for-dollar replacement, I mean that if your school district is bringing in $1 million in school property taxes, they will receive, as a starting point, they will receive $1 million in replacement funding. If it's $10 million, they'll receive $10 million, and so on.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in years one, I understand how that would work. What about in the out years, years 2, 3, 4, and so on?
In the years that follow the initial driving out of the dollar-for-dollar replacement, we will see an inflationary index put into place. And the way the amendment is drafted is if the sales tax produces the sales and income taxes, if those two taxes together, let's say they grow at a rate of 5%, and the inflationary index as computed by the CPIU, again, that's defined in the legislation, something we use in numerous other legislation. If the CPIU is 2.5 and the increase in the sales tax and the income tax is at 5%, the legislation calls for the lower of the two to be utilized. So in the instance I just described, 2.5% would be the growth that would be allowed, and that additional amount on top of the base year, that additional amount will be driven out to school districts to ensure that they're allowed to grow, again, at the rate of inflation. Now, the legislation says it's the lower of the two. So if the reverse were true and the CPIU were 5% somehow and the taxes only grew at 2.5%, it would still be 2.5, but it would be because the sales and income tax only grew at that level.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, given that the formula will drive out funding to school districts based on what they're getting today, and then on an inflationary index moving forward, we have, since Act 120 of 2010, the state has created a pension spike that I believe starts in 2016 and starts to level off in 2022. Under that legislation, school districts would be required to increase their employer contribution by upwards of 35%, I believe, 33, 35%. If your amendment would become law, how would school districts raise the necessary revenue to cover the pension spike that they are now required under law to pay for?
I think the simple answer to that is this legislation is not designed to address the underlying basic education funding formula that is problematic. It's not designed to address the pension spike There are numerous other pieces of legislation out there that focus on both of those issues and other issues that need to be addressed. There are cost drivers that my legislation, that this amendment cannot address. The role of this bill or this amendment, as it's contained here today, is a simple replacement. It is the question, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, of do you want to replace school property taxes with sales and income tax? If you want to address the pension problem, there are numerous members who who have legislation that can focus on that. I absolutely believe we need to approach the pension problem, and we need to resolve it. You said in your remarks that it's a state-created problem. I agree. We messed it up. It was before my time and your time, before we were elected, but we messed it up here in the legislature, and we need to fix it, rather than passing that back to the school districts. There is no provision in here to attack the pension problem, the funding formula problem. We have a dollar-for-dollar replacement. We're keeping it simple. That debate on those other issues is for another day. It's for other legislation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While I couldn't agree more with you that we need to address the pension problems in our state, at this point, under existing law, we've developed a construct where local school districts provide funding and make decisions. And part of that funding right now is the fact that pensions were underfunded. And they have been obligated to pay that money, regardless of what changes we make here. My question still remains, what under your legislation, how would school districts pay for their pension obligations if this were enacted?
Well, if we as a legislature are completely irresponsible, as we sometimes are, if we are completely irresponsible and we choose to pass that back to the school districts and say, you alone are responsible for fixing this, if we don't rein things in, if we don't make changes, then school districts will be faced with quite a problem. In the same way that if we don't address the underlying basic education funding formula, school districts are going to continue to see that it is harder and harder for them to create an environment where students can learn. The design of this amendment contains cost controls. Cost controls that for the first time in history, as touched on from my colleague from Allegheny County, cost controls that finally put some limits and put an end to the spending, the credit card spending, the seemingly limitless credit card spending that some of our school districts are currently doing. And so those cost controls are my way, and the supporters of this amendment, it's our way of saying enough is enough. We're going to limit what school districts are doing, but at the same time, I believe it's our responsibility as a legislature to go after that funding formula and make sure it's fair, to go after those pension problems and take responsibility for how it was messed up by this legislature in 2001 and the following years.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. And you know, you and I couldn't agree more that we need cost containment at all levels of government, but can you try to tell me specifically what options would school districts have to cover the pension spike that they will face between 2016 and 2022. Right now, the state pays half, the local districts pay half. The state will have a very similar pension increase in their pension liability in the same time period. What will the options be for the local school districts to cover those pension costs?
Well, under existing law, and I'll give two scenarios here. Under existing law, what school districts are going to have to do is look at one of their local revenue sources, and that includes the earned income tax, business privilege taxes that some school districts have in place, earned income taxes, net profits taxes, all variations of local taxes. Right now, they have the ability to increase all of those. If this amendment goes into place, we're not removing any of those other local taxes. So a school district could still utilize whatever we have currently authorized for local tax changes. And if they needed a local effort, they would rely on the other sources, which would not obviously include the school property tax since we're eliminating it. So we also, in this amendment, This amendment provides, if a school district so desired, they could actually put that in front of their taxpayers, and they could say to their taxpayers, we have this concern, this problem with funding the pension increase, which some will say was created by the legislature, others will say it was created by the local school district with their salary levels and so forth. But regardless of where you stand on that, school districts will have the ability to go to their taxpayers and say, we are looking at a pension shortfall, and because of that, we want you to pay an earned income tax or a personal income tax at the following rate for the following period of time in order to cover that pension shortfall. And so they will be able to go to the taxpayers to cover that. If the taxpayers say no, the taxpayers' word has to stand, their decision has to stand, and they will then have to rely on one of those other taxes that is in place. Again, the vast majority of those, or quite a few of those, fall on the earned income tax as it exists under other provisions of law, or the nuisance taxes, as some people call under Act 511 in the Public School Code.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, if I can understand your response, school districts will have to raise earned income taxes and personal income taxes to cover the pension increase that is coming down the line. Now, if I can just ask one last question. Given a school district that under House Bill 76 is drafted in Amendment 3448, some school districts will be paying more in increased sales and income tax than they currently do in property taxes for their local school district. So for the school district, we'll say, as an example, a school district in Westmoreland County that's going to be paying more in income tax and sales tax, and they're going to be sending the difference to the state to cover education funding in other areas of the Commonwealth. You're then going to turn around to those same taxpayers and tell them that their local school district has to raise more income taxes to cover the pension shortfall that they're going to see, that's known that they're going to see it between 2016 and 2022. You're going to say you're already paying more in sales and income taxes. You're sending it to the state to subsidize other school districts, but we're going to ask the local school district to raise taxes even more to cover that pension spike at the local level. Is my understanding correct?
We're not requiring them to do it, but you're working from the premise that the legislature is going to be completely irresponsible and not tackle the pension issue. I, for one, am going to advocate for tackling the pension issue in a meaningful way so that we don't burden our school districts at that level. I think it's patently unfair for us to have created a scenario and exacerbated a scenario of irresponsibility. If they've been irresponsible, we've let them do it. And so those districts that are being irresponsible with their property tax levels, this amendment is an attempt to rein that in. We need to do the same types of things to say to school districts, we see that we made some mistakes here, and we as a legislature are going to take up some of that slack. I don't think that you're working from the premise that we will do nothing, and I think that's a flawed premise. And so it's a difficult question to answer. You're making the assumption that we're not going to do anything. I, for one, think that's completely irresponsible, and shame on us if we let that fall directly on just the school districts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That concludes my interrogation.